So, most people look at the woolly mammoth as though it were some kind of dinosaur, a primeval creature that existed long, long ago in some vague era before humanity.
The last woolly mammoths in Canada died nearly 10,000 years ago.
Many people probably don't even realize that woolly mammoths continued to be born for thousands of years after the Ice Age, and they didn't even completely go extinct until almost 1,000 years after the building of the Great Pyramids. Long after the pyramids had been erected, a living, breathing population of woolly mammoths could still be found on an Arctic island off the coast of Siberia, and by the time they finally went extinct, ancient civilizations had already risen around the entire planet. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an explorer and an anthropologist, and this is Extinctions Through Time. The woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, was the last and most successful member of a lineage that had been walking this planet for hundreds of thousands of years. First diverging from ancient elephants in Africa and then spreading across Europe, Asia, and eventually down into the Americas, where they are probably most famous. Really quickly, this is a series that I created in collaboration with Colossal Biosciences, who also has a YouTube channel that's worth checking out. Some mammoth species were even larger than most elephants existing today, up to 13 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing up to 6 or 7 tons. But what usually goes entirely overlooked is that a vast portion of the mammoth's existence was alongside human beings. We shared the earth with the woolly mammoth for at least 200,000 years. Humans hunted them, used their bones for tools, and painted pictures of them on cave walls. The 40,000-year-old paintings found in caves from ancient France and Spain show incredibly sophisticated artwork that use shading to show motion of the animal when light from the flickering fire hits the cave walls. And the paintings are so anatomically accurate that paleontologists were able to use them to confirm the mammoth's coat and posture. And this is not even the only example where this happened. Paleontologists have also used cave paintings of lions to identify new big cat species that existed during the Ice Age. But it seems that wherever humans arrive in significant numbers, major extinction events are soon to follow. From Europe to Asia, the Americas, even the islands of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, the pattern repeats too often across too many continents and oceans to be a coincidence. But that doesn't necessarily mean that humans hunted the woolly mammoth or other extinct species to extinction. Usually, there's something that's far more difficult to pinpoint. At the height of their range, woolly mammoths could be found crossing the vast stretches of wilderness from Western Europe across all of Siberia, down into China, and across the Bering Land Bridge, down into North America. This insanely large and now extinct ecosystem is known today as the Mammoth Steppe. It was the single largest terrestrial biome on Earth, containing somewhere between 20 to 40 entire megafauna species that are extinct today. And here is where the human side of this history just becomes near impossible to imagine. At the same moment that the last woolly mammoths were disappearing from mainland Europe around 10,000 BC, human beings in what is today Turkey were constructing Göbekli Tepe, massive carved limestone pillars raised in ceremonial circles by people with no metal tools and no known written language. The people carving elaborate animal reliefs into stone had recent ancestors who had actually hunted mammoths. The distance between mammoth hunter and temple builder was actually not thousands and thousands of years like you may think. It was actually only 2 or 3 generations, meaning that the temple builders of Göbekli Tepe had very likely heard stories from their grandparents about woolly mammoths, which almost certainly played into the people of Göbekli Tepe's obvious reverence for their local wildlife. Then by 8000 BC, when mammoths still survived on Arctic circles and even in pockets of North America, the Neolithic Revolution was reshaping the entire human world. And people had the realization that when seeds were deliberately planted, they would grow. That sheep and goats corralled and carefully bred together didn't have to be chased across the steppe anymore. The invention of agriculture, the single most consequential transformation in human history, was happening at the exact same time that the mammoth's world was rapidly collapsing. By 5000 BC, when the final pockets of woolly mammoths in North America were disappearing, the Sumerians had just invented the wheel and were beginning to develop the very first writing system. The very first true cities of the ancient world were also emerging along the Tigris and Euphrates River, as well as soon followed by the Nile River. Within the next 1,000 years, Mesopotamia had sprouted into an identifiable ancient civilization, and the Egyptians were beginning to harness real power along the Nile with their very first pharaohs, and the Americans were also seeing the construction of their very first pyramids erected along the Peruvian coast. Civilization was beginning to emerge everywhere all around the world. But the presence of the woolly mammoth had shrunk down from this hemisphere-ranging mammoth steppe down to just a single island along the Siberian coast, Wrangel Island. A small, remote, and mountainous Arctic island about 150 kilometers across. The island was completely and utterly cut off from humanity, not only because of its extreme remote location on the opposite side of the Siberian wilderness, but also its extreme cold, with low annual temperatures around -22 degrees Fahrenheit and brief highs of around 35 degrees Fahrenheit during the height of the summer, if you can call that a summer. These conditions basically put the mammoths of Wrangel Island on an entirely separate planet from humanity, which is why they survived for thousands of years beyond mammoths anywhere else in the world. The proposed date of the completion of the Great Pyramid is around 2600 BC, and paleontological evidence points towards the fact that the last woolly mammoths of Wrangel Island existed until around 1650 BC, which is nearly 1,000 years later. Ancient Egypt was already ancient by the time those mammoths of Wrangel Island had finally disappeared. And if they'd survived just a few hundred years longer, they would have lived alongside the events of the Trojan War and the collapse of Bronze Age civilization. Okay, so zooming back out to the existence of woolly mammoths along the Mammoth Steppe, from Western Europe across Asia, Siberia, and down into North America. What was it that actually drove this massive animal to extinction, and why don't they exist alongside our modern-day elephant? So this is one of the most controversial and contentious arguments being made by paleontologists today. Was it the effect of cataclysmic climate change rapidly heating the planet, driving species that had adapted to the cold mammoth steppe to extinction? Or was it hunters moving through the mammoth steppe, chasing mammoths across the wilderness, killing and butchering them all the way to extinction? Most likely, it was a multitude of factors beyond just the climate rapidly warming and melting away the world that Ice Age creatures had evolved to thrive within, and human hunters pushing through the wilderness, hunting down mammoths, and harvesting their meat for food and bones for tools. It's more likely that humans pushing into the mammoth steppe and beginning to compete in the food chain in general created a sudden imbalance that fragmented the mammoth's environment and migration paths, isolating some groups away from their typical ranges. As this hunting pressure steadily continued, the climate began rapidly heating up, literally melting away the mammoth's world from beneath their giant feet, until the mammoth steppe was cut down the middle as the Bering Strait sank beneath the sea, and little by little the mammoth found itself struggling to survive in a landscape that had continued to evolve away from the environment it had known for thousands and thousands of years, and eventually the mammoths of the mainland disappeared. For most of recorded history, humans had absolutely no idea what a mammoth was. When frozen carcasses thawed out of Siberian permafrost, occasionally and spectacularly with fur and flesh still intact, local people could only explain them as the remains of enormous underground creatures that died when they surfaced into sunlight. The word mammoth itself, in fact, most likely is derived from a Mansi or Estonian word meaning earth mole. When the very first frozen specimen reached European scientists in the early 1800s, it completely rewrote what naturalists, who are earth scientists at the time, believed was possible, that an entire species of enormous animal could actually vanish from the earth. At the time, extinction itself was still somehow a controversial idea. Many scientists believed that God could not possibly permit a created species to simply cease to exist. And actually, Thomas Jefferson himself was a big proponent of this idea as well, believing in the 1700s that woolly mammoths almost certainly had to exist somewhere out in the wilderness of western North America, and he employed Lewis and Clark to find them. It's also part of the reason that the United States made the Louisiana Purchase. What followed over the next 2 centuries was one of the most remarkable windows into a lost world that science has ever opened. Frozen remains recovered from Siberia have revealed to us what the very last meals consumed by the last mammoths were, meaning that we can identify the exact types of grass and other plants that they were grazing on before they vanished. We have mammoth hair, mammoth skin, and mammoth blood cells. We've even used their remains to analyze and reconstruct what mammoths would have actually sounded like, which is probably the most most evocative thing that gives us a sense of what it felt like to exist in this lost world. The Siberian permafrost preserves biological remains so well that we have intact cell nuclei which have been recovered, allowing scientists to read their genome almost in its entirety, which is basically a complete biological manual of the makeup of an animal that hasn't existed in thousands of years.
We know what they looked like by reconstructing their remains, found preserved in mud and gravel in ancient riverbeds or bogs.
So in 2024, the biotechnology company Colossal Biosciences confirmed that its Woolly Mammoth de-extinction project, with the Woolly Mammoth being Colossal's flagship target, had achieved its most significant genomic milestones yet. Using ancient DNA recovered from permafrost-preserved specimens, Colossal scientists have been systematically editing the Asian elephant genome, the mammoth's closest living relative, sharing 99.6% of its DNA, toward functional mammoth traits. The cold resistance genes, the fat distribution genes, the dense layered coat, the specialized hemoglobin. The work is still in progress, the genome has been read, and the woolly mammoth blueprint really exists. So, from ancient humans painting the woolly mammoth on their cave walls, to now, thousands of years later, pulling the remains of these mammoths from the permafrost, human beings are still amazed by this species, and it forces us to ask the question: what do we owe to a species whose extinction we clearly played some major part in, when thousands of years later we have the ability to effectively bring them back from extinction and give this species another chapter in our world? And personally, of all the things that we modern people find ourselves doing, I can hardly think of anything that's more important than trying to preserve and, when we can, resurrect parts of our lost world. And in a large part, I think that these decisions will be some of the defining moments of our century. I'm Luke Caverns. Like and subscribe for more videos of the history of lost species, and I'll see you next time.